I made a classic mistake, which was to have realized too late as I was sitting for the last half hour next to my old friend Edith de Montebello that I should have gone to Edith first to prepare some remarks about Philippe. She voluntarily gave me 12 anecdotes, all of which are, each on their own would bring a house down. Philippe is censoring them, and of course that makes them even more appealing. But it's wonderful to have both of them. And of course, much has been written about our honoree, that he built the Met into the greatest museum in the world, doubled its size, boldly steered its collections, increased its financial resources exponentially, and welcomed millions upon millions of visitors each year to the treasures behind that stately edifice. And that he accomplished all this wizardry in part by trusting in his curatorial staff and by asserting the primacy of rigor in all spheres of the administration and oversight of that institution. One of the pleasures of preparing these remarks is to, even though it's a person I've known since I was a teenager, is to rediscover him through the voluminous amount of material that, of course, has been written and reinforced my excitement that he was willing to come up the river to be with us. We are, of course, a library, and we have a natural interest in biography. Guy Philippe de Montebello. All right, so he knows I'm going to mangle the French part of this. He knows where my formative experience learning French was north of this border, which is an incredibly beautiful and fantastic part of the world, but not an area particularly regarded for its graceful command of the French language. In any case, according to the New Yorker, he grew up in a family that was descended on his mother's side from the Marquis de Sade.
It explains everything.
I held that back from the board when we discussed who we might be able to invite this year. On his father's side, from Marshal Jean Lannes, one of Napoleon's generals. Napoleon named him Duc de Montebello after his victory in the Battle of Montebello. I can't help but think that if my own great-grandfather Desmond-Fish had stayed on a little longer with General Washington during the fighting here in the Highlands, I might instead be descended from the Duc de Neuburg. And Philippe, we'd be awarding you a somewhat different prize today. It gets much better. Philippe's great-grandmother, the Comtesse Laure de Chevigny, was one of the models for Proust's Duchesse de Gourmont. That's not right. Guermantes. Better, huh? His aunt, Marie-Laure de Noailles, was a famous and somewhat scandalous patron of avant-garde art and letters in Paris between the wars. Philippe went often to her great house in the Place des États-Unis and once attended a bullfight in Nîmes with her and Picasso. Foreshadowing. To the millions who attended the great exhibitions mounted under his stewardship at the Met, Philippe was also known for his rich and sonorous baritone, described by the New Yorker as purring with Gallic sibilants and labials in the acoustic-guided ear of countless visitors to the museum. Perhaps my favorite phrase from a New Yorker profile ever. Indeed, the journalist and critic Charles McGrath wrote that de Montebello pronounces Renaissance in a way that practically reenacts it. Derek Bach, who became president of Harvard after Philippe had graduated, once described the chief executive's role as that of a circus acrobat, balancing atop a large ball and rolling along a narrow plank across a pit of fire. For 3 decades, writes the Wall Street Journal, Philippe de Montebello was that acrobat at the Met, brilliantly managing his demanding trustees, sidestepping saber-toothed journalists, taming the great cats of his legendary curatorial staff, all because he believed fervently in the art museum as a vital force for human betterment. This occasion has a root in an earlier event. 20 years ago in the galleries of the Met, Sandra and I were walking down a corridor headed in the direction of the paintings of the African-American painter Horace Pippin. Without warning or explanation, I suddenly felt a strong pull toward a nondescript section of the corridor. On the wall, I found I was looking at a very long, narrow picture which contained thousands of tiny human figures. Moving closer, I saw that almost all the figures were black soldiers in uniform. In the foreground was an incongruous row of white officers. And there, kneeling and staring right at me, was Captain Hamilton Fish of the 369th Regiment of New York, better known during World War I as the Harlem Hellfighters. I won't tell you on that occasion that my grandfather whispered in my ear that we should invite Philippe to the library. But museums are natural settings for a metaphysical experience, and the seed for today's wonderful event was planted that afternoon. Philippe de Montebello has said, "I'm the most grateful person on earth. I've had the privilege to run the greatest institution in the world. How much luckier can you be than that?" Philippe, we all feel lucky to have you with us today, both you and Edith. And on behalf of your extended fan base here in the Hudson Highlands, it's my privilege to welcome you to Garrison and to award you the Hamilton de Fish Prize. In recognition of your incomparable guardianship of our history and culture, Philippe de Montebello. As advertised, the highlight of today's occasion, we have a public conversation with our neighbor and the director of the Museum of Modern Art, Glenn Lowry, and Philippe de Montebello. Please welcome Glenn Lowry.
I'm on the right.
You're always on. I like being on the left.
I know.
Can everyone hear? Well, first,
Before starting the conversation, I think it would be appropriate, maybe, or civil even, to say thank you to Ham for. I mean, I've been introduced many times in the world, but I don't think as wonderfully as this. So thank you for leaving out the anecdotes that Edith might have put you, and for providing such a wonderful setting. I now realize that all of these Hudson River pictures at the Met are not of an imaginary landscape. It exists. So in the presence of the sublime...
Shall we go to the ridiculous? First of all, congratulations to you. It's a deserving award. And I should say to all of you that in addition to everything that Hamilton Fish said about Philippe, there's another aspect to him that those of us who've been privileged to work with him as colleagues over the years know, and that is he is a generous mentor, a great colleague, and a very good friend. So it's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Thank you, Tim.
And we could begin with the Marquis de Sade, but we'll leave that for another moment.
It's been diluted a little bit.
So it goes. What I want to do is start, Philippe, with your thoughts about not just the Met, but maybe museums in general over the last, let's say, 30 or 40 years. You began really at a kind of pivot moment in American history. There were all sorts of social movements, unrest. The museums were seen as maybe even centers of debate and caught up in all sorts of issues. 30 years later, it's a very different landscape. What do you see as the big changes that have actually happened to the American Museum during that time?
I think the biggest change in the American museums happened in the time of my predecessor, Tom Hoving. We were colleagues. He was curator of medieval art and of the cloisters, our subsidiary of medieval art. And I was a young curator in the Department of Paintings. And then after a couple of years in Houston, I came back to be his chief curator. And during those years were the years in which Tom Hoving basically opened up the museum world, a museum that had spoken a great deal in all its public rhetoric about being open, but to a certain degree remained accessible only as it was in the earliest days when it started in the 18th century as an elitist, relatively elitist institution. And I think you like architecture. One of the emblematic moves of Tom Hoving was turning the steps that were exiguous and leading very narrowly up the door to the flayed steps now in front of the Met, that allow all the vendors to sell their hot dogs. But aside from this melancholy sight that we have on 82nd and 5th, that kind of opening, I think it was a huge change. It was accompanied by much larger exhibitions. You know, as a young curator in the paintings department, where I was 7 years before moving to Houston, I never mounted a single exhibition. My department never mounted a show, and I think the Met mounted 3 in 7 years. So it's been an immense change, the notion of the event for which people came. Now, of course, in a place like New York, you and I are privileged. Our concern is not how to get people in, but how to keep them out, essentially. That is not the case for most of
If you've ever seen him on Fifth Avenue with a sword, that's because he's protecting the institution.
No, it's my academician sword. And so, you know, I followed a little bit in that mold, because it's a vicious circle, as you well know. You build it, you have to fill it, you have to fund it, you have to continue to fund it, you have to continue to fill it. Things go well, you build some more, and you get kind of caught up, as the museum world has a little bit today.
I always thought that the rivalry between Tom Hoving and Carter Brown, which fueled a great deal of tremendous exhibitions and a lot of interest in these two great institutions. Carter Brown was the director of the National Gallery in Washington. That it was more Carter who was striving to open the museum in a kind of populist way than it was Tom Hoving. Is that a misperception?
No, I don't know more or less. I think both men were of that same ilk, so to speak. The real rivalry was between Sherman Lee in Cleveland, who was extremely conservative, and Tom Hoving. The Carter Brown Hoving rivalry was who is going to get the biggest show, and they fought for the same thing, but simply who was going to get it first. Carter was quite smart politically. He invented a law, so to speak, or a statute in the charter of the National Gallery in Washington, stating that every major international exhibition had to open at the National Gallery first. No such language exists anywhere, but it seemed to work for a long time. But Sherman Lee was of another generation and really believed totally in the primacy of art, in art at the center of everything from which everything devolves, and that the experience of art simply could not be diluted by, so to speak, the masses. He was a little bit like Edmond Goncourt who had a great collection in the 18th century, a wonderful writer, wonderful collector, but when he wrote his will, and he had a marvelous collection towards the end of the 19th century, he said, I do not under any circumstances want my works of art to end up in museums there to be exposed to the stupid gaze of the populace. Now, Sherman Lee wasn't quite that bad, but that's more where the rivalry was.
And do you think it's possible today, in this hyper-mediated age, to balance scholarship, quiet contemplation, and this deep public interest in mass participation in exhibitions? Are we living in a kind of dream world to believe that that's possible?
It's possible because it's happening. At different levels, obviously, of civility and comfort. On the issue of scholarship, I think it's a complete, I can't remember what the expression is, but it's a false argument that all of these large shows, many shows that happen, somehow, because they are popular, are not scholarly. I think the catalogue of the Matisse cutouts, the catalogues of the great Byzantine shows at the Met, the current show of Assyria and Iberia, the great monographs created by museums become, in fact, the scholarly works of record. And they are the ones used in the academies and by scholars. And to a certain degree, one of the reasons for this is that they are based on a form of scholarship that seeks its primary information from the work of art itself, rather than imposing a whole series of ideologies and academic discourses upon the work of art. So the work of art is the source of its own, as it should be, its own information. So many of these large exhibitions have and are indeed totally scholarly. Now, the issue of how do you engage with the work of art when you are in a museum gallery and surrounded by people is one of the great paradoxes of the museum. Museums are hives of paradoxes, and one of them is we both want as many of you, as many people as possible, to come and enjoy works of art. But the crux of it, we don't want these people to come when we are there. And so, how you reconcile that? I mean, if you've ever stood...
He can say that now, I can't.
I hope for a long time you can't. But that is very true. And in the little book that you'll see coming out that I've sort of just finished with an English critic, Martin Gateford, we travel around museums, and we're in the Mauritshuis, and we can't even approach the Vermeer of the girl with the earring. So we went and looked at two wonderful church interiors by Sanré-Dame. And even then, I mean, they are magical pictures, not a well-known name, so you can get a little closer to them. You feel a group of people behind you, and you have the sense that after a few seconds, which is not very long, is it, to give time to work of art, you feel you have to move on, to let someone else go through. So the great trap of our museums, our visual arts museums, is unlike the performing arts, which I experienced seriatim. At the blink of an eye, quite literally, you can take in a work of art and move on, and you can pretty much describe superficially what it's about. And it's a great trap, because in fact you know nothing about it. You haven't given it the time, you haven't penetrated within its inner secrets.
That brings up that beautiful book you've written, Rendezvous with Art, with Martin. And it seems to me, having just finished it, that it's a kind of oscillating meditation on museums and art, because you're looking at art in museums and you reflect on the museum, the different museums that you're visiting, from the Prado to the Louvre to Mauritshuis to the Metropolitan. But you're always engaged in a conversation about the works of art that attract you. And I wonder if you would speak for a moment about Velázquez and Titian, because I was surprised who you came down on as your favorite artist, thinking of you as a great sensualist.
As a great centralist or essentialist?
Sensualist.
Or sensualist? Which for you would be Titian over Velázquez.
Titian, yeah.
First, a disclaimer. The book is not that much about what we chose and what we liked. He lives in London. I live in New York. We have two, and he's a very busy man. Just finished a book of Michelangelo as well as on Lucian Freud and on Hockney. And the book is about where our agendas met. I'm giving a lecture in Florence. Martin, can you fly over? So we did Florence. I never did Berlin, never did the National Gallery in London or the Uffizi in Florence or the Hermitage. Once at the Met, and that's all in America. So the book is purely serendipitous and in a sense very arbitrary from that point of view. But because I'm on the board of the Prado, I spend a great deal of time in Madrid, so we were a great deal of time in Madrid. And as it turns out, Martin Gayford loves Titian, as do I, but I seem to appear to love Velázquez even more than Titian in the book. It's very hard to make these comparisons. There is a certain quality about the consummate masterpiece, which is difficult to describe, but I think the best way to put it is whenever you're in front of, let's say, the Ghent altarpiece of Van Eyck, the only thing that you can think of is this is the greatest picture in the world. There are probably 24 works in this world that I can think of in front of which one would wish to exclaim, this is the greatest picture in the world. I happen to have done it in front of Velázquez. Manet would have agreed with me and said indeed the same. And Martin in front of Titian. But it wouldn't take much for me to flip the two when you're at that level.
And what is it about Velázquez that attracts you when you're looking at one of his great paintings, Las Meninas, let's say?
Truth and humanity. Velázquez is a magician. He turns paint into life. I think to a higher degree than almost any other artist has been able to do. And it's hard to say because, and we make that point very much in the book, these are also very personal, very individual reactions. Your response to Velázquez might be very different from mine. One is not right or wrong. But with Velázquez, you never have a sense of artifice. It is always absolutely the most honest kind of painting. The closest thing on another level, and a very different kind of level, would be the work of Chardin. Totally honest painting, simply abandoning yourself to a paint surface. Now, I use the word surface, and one of the things that I make very strongly throughout this book is the importance not only of giving a work of art time, but of being close to it. All of you, there may be one or two exceptions in this room, I guarantee you, always stand too far away from a work of art. And if you stand far enough away from a work of art, you have turned it into an image. It is no longer a surface, a physical object.
So when the security officer at the Met tells you to step back, you just say, Philippe de Montebello told you to stand there.
Glenn, I'm glad you brought that up. It must have been 30 years ago. I was at the Frick looking at that divine picture by Giovanni Bellini of St. Francis in the Wilderness. And I stood in front of it and I just began to look at the little rabbit, at the landscape, at the light. And then from the corner of my eye, I was watching a guard looking at me. And after what probably was 4 or 5 minutes, an eternity in a museum in front of a picture, the guard came up to me and said, "Sir, what are you doing?"
But what Philippe just said is really worth spending a moment on. Because the pleasures that we get from looking at art, whether it's a work of painting, sculpture, drawing, it doesn't matter, reveal themselves slowly. And they reveal themselves in the details. And that is the paradox that we have of having so many people in a museum and yet also wanting everybody to take the same pleasure that we get in a very private moment when we can do that kind of careful looking and contemplation. And I think there's one thread that comes through this book with Martin is this notion of careful looking, that you can teach yourself about a work of art even if you don't know its history. There's a lot that can be learned from that surface, from, in a way, decoding all of the imagery that's there. And I think you do a beautiful job of extracting that on a number of occasions. But let's turn to a fragment. You begin the book with a little object, a shard almost, and yet a hauntingly beautiful Egyptian work. Why that work?
The work is the little yellow jasper lips from the 2nd millennium BC, probably definitely from the Amarna school. It's been called Nefertiti. I don't think it's Queen Nefertiti, but it's in that range. And it's the bottom half of the face. In fact, only the chin and the lips carved in one of the hardest stones that you can carve, yellow jasper, but beautifully and highly polished, clearly therefore a queen of some sort. The polish would have been reserved for a member of royalty. And to me, a couple of things strike me about the work, aside simply from its sheer beauty to my eyes, also the skill, imagining the kind of tool just emery and sort of creating that carving is absolutely astonishing. But also the notion of the fragment, and again another paradox, the fragment becoming in a way the symbol of permanence, and the whole, which is lost, is the ephemeral part. And that's what museums are. They basically collect fragments or they create fragments. Because when you take an altarpiece that is essentially a utilitarian object for the cult, in a church, in a temple, wherever it may be, and bring it into a museum, you remove it from its actual architectural context, the context of all of the other things around which that surrounded it, and that were in the mind of the artist who created it. And so the museum is essentially a high-level collection of fragments, fragmentary objects, fragments of our history, vestiges, fragmentary vestiges of the past. And one of our challenges is to recompose that past as coherently as one possibly can.
Well, you mentioned removal, and I think that brings up removal of works of art from their original context, and I think that brings up naturally the issue of restitution.
Does it?
No. I do have to tell a little anecdote. Philippe might have forgotten it. And it's a kind of mini version of restitution. When I was appointed to the Museum of Modern Art in 1995, among the first calls I got was a congratulatory call from Philippe, which was followed up by a call that said, so about those Van Goghs that belong to us that you need to, and it was in fact true, alas, that one of our great donors, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, died at a time when there was an accord between the Met and MoMA where works of art 50 years or more that were deemed to be masterpieces were to be transferred to the Met, and in return the Museum of Modern Art would receive funds to continue buying. It's an accord that lasted, I think, for 2 years, but in that interim period, she died, and so she left to the Met. I don't know why she did that. The spectacularly beautiful drawings. So that was a form of restitution, at least as far as I was concerned. But I want to talk about other restitutions and begin with the one that's taken up so much public time, and that's Holocaust restitution. And do you see that as a momentary time that those issues will no longer be that important, or are we going to spend decades excavating our collections in an effort to ensure that there aren't any tainted objects?
It's a complicated issue, as you well know. You were on the same committees I was on, both for World War II spoliated goods, as well as the committee about antiquities. And you will recall that at the AMD, the art, music, what is that? I forgot.
Yeah, art and government.
American.
Association of Art Museum Directors.
Something. Okay. Anyway, it brings people like us together. We decided that there would be two different committees debating the two issues of the spoliated antiquities or looted antiquities and spoliated works of art for one fundamental reason, and it comes to your question, which is when you are taking against the laws, smart or not smart, of a particular country, depending on how you feel about patrimony and sharing the common heritage of mankind, a potsherd, the fragment of a statue, whether it be from Turkey or from Italy or from one of the source countries as they're called, you are breaking conceivably a law of that particular country, but you aren't exactly desecrating a site, nor are you engaged in genocide. With World War II, you are dealing not with a purely legal issue, but with a moral issue, and so we wanted to keep it apart. How long it will last? I think it will last as long, conceivably, as human memory, and most likely not as long as people think, because there's a great fantasy out there, as we know, those of us who have studied the figures, in terms of the numbers of works out there that in fact can still be restituted. It's a very, very small number. After the war, after the receiving point in Munich and so forth, more than 90% of works we know were actually restituted. A great many of the works that were stolen from people that were destroyed, killed, were not famous paintings, were not Schiller's or Van Gogh's. They were pieces of decorative art, a Jacob commode, silver, objects that in any inventory simply cannot be recognized. A silver service by Le Monnier. Well, there are many. Which one is it? Is it that one? The same thing with sculpture and most pictures, French landscape, early 19th century, end of story. So the number of works likely to come up, and occasionally you have, as in recently, a media event with the collector, and I think in fact that Matisse was already restituted. But 90% of those works also happen to be drawings. They're works on paper. So much is said about the press about all these masterpieces, but there are a few, and they affect enormous prices. But with enough time, obviously the heirs are more and more distant. They themselves fight among themselves. There are false claims and so forth, and everything has to be very carefully reviewed. But I don't see a terminus to it. I think so long as at any time a work is discovered that was spoliated in World War II, that you can document, and you can document the heir, then I think the museums and collectors, the auction houses, will have an obligation. Antiquities is a whole other issue.
You want to talk for a moment about antiquities? Because you, in a way, set the benchmark. It should be said that for certainly a good part of my professional career, the Met was the place that was able to hold off the claims of source countries for works of art that were at the Met. But then you struck what was nothing short of a brilliant accord with, I believe it was the Italian Ministry of Culture, that reversed that whole logic. And so, do you want to talk a little bit about how that reframed the conversation?
Well, very briefly, because it is a huge topic. And this is a postprandial talk, and I don't know how long we've already been talking. And to me, it's a painful one. You know, I came back from returning Euphronia's crater to Italy, and I had 6 weeks of shingles. I was so upset because I did not believe in what I did. I did it because I had to, because of an obligation. It became a legal obligation, because for some curious reason, the American judiciary has decided that the patrimonial laws of foreign countries trump any US law. And so the greatest threat the Met had with the Euphronius crater, with the great silver treasure that so-called might have come from Sicily, it isn't even proven, was not so much problems with Italy, no loans or loans being denied, but seizure on the part of the Attorney General in New York of the American judiciary, as happened to Michael Steinhardt while he was traveling in Europe. This is the United States. I've forgotten which arm of government came into his apartment and took
Customs.
out, was it Customs?
It was Customs.
It was Customs, and took out a work of art in the United States, breaking in the door and basically taking photographs of everything in absentia in his apartment. So the Euphronius crater is now the 4,758th vase at the Villa Giulia in Rome, and the painter Euphronius is no longer represented at the Met. Now, what I did strike as a deal with the Italians was that for every work that somehow, for legal, ethical, or other reasons, would be returned by the Metropolitan to a country of origin, in this case with Italy, a work of equivalent importance would be placed on loan and change every 4 years at the Metropolitan with the label saying on loan from the government of Italy. And I will say, Italy actually lived up to its part of the deal, and wonderful objects have been lent in exchange. But the whole philosophical issue of whether the entire patrimony of a particular country needs to be in that country is another one. And if you look at what is happening today in the Middle East, that fantastic Umayyad mosque in Aleppo, and you're an Islamicist, destroyed, and how many other sites destroyed, sites in northern Iraq, such as Babylon, or others that are the source of our civilization. To a certain degree, the exhibition of Assyria to Iberia, as it is at the Met, shows you works on loan from Western museums that are now not being destroyed by shells and deliberately by iconoclasts from the Sunnis. But in any event, when you have a stock portfolio, I think you're advised to diversify, and I don't see any reason why a cultural portfolio shouldn't be diversified. Can you imagine if the only way you could know Greek art was to go to Greece, and there was no other way of doing it? Our cities are cosmopolitan cities in which the inhabitants come from all over the world. They should be able to see part of their patrimony also in their local museums.
So let's turn to happier things. Duccio. I have the... Ham, can we get some water? Yeah, thanks. So, as we draw this conversation to a close, but we'll take some questions, let's turn to happier things. I have the impression, both from conversations you and I have had, but also from your book, that the acquisition of that beautiful little Duccio was a high point for you in terms of the mark you left on the Met. Is that true? And do you want to talk about sort of the key works of art that you were privileged enough to acquire that really mark your tenure?
Well, when you speak about acquisitions, you speak about, and it probably is the same for you, obviously the most rewarding thing that a museum director can possibly do. Our job is to collect and preserve great works of aesthetic merit. And so the collection of those works, and in a place like the Met, the completion of a great encyclopedia in which you want no letter missing, was achieved in the acquisition of this Duccio, the work by the great Sienese Trecento painter, an artist not represented in the collection, and it wasn't simply filling a gap. This is not, in fact, part of the predella of the great Maestà in Siena. This is an individual, self-contained, complete picture by Duccio, and in fact, a picture that in 1904, when Siena held a gigantic exhibition with some 300 Sienese works, it was seen by a great art historian of Italian art at the time, who happened to be married to Bernard Berenson, And she writes in her notebooks that having seen all 300 works in Siena, the single work of art in that show, that to her was the monument to human creativity and the most moving, was the little Duccio that the Met ended up buying. Now, knowing this, knowing a number of other things, made it important, obviously, for us to acquire. The other thing that I should say, and I've never mentioned this, so this is a first. I happen to be one of the few people. Tom Hoving made a lot of enemies. Tom Hoving should have sued himself for libel for writing the books that he wrote, because he was a much better man than the way he represented himself. I loved working for Tom Hoving. He was brilliant. He was a real scholar, a medievalist, a wonderful eye. Yes, he was capricious and crazy, but we got along very well, except that when he left the Met, which was not under good circumstances, he never set foot in the place again, and a lot of vitriol was sent back at a number of people there. And so for 35 years, or however many it was, he and I never spoke. And when I bought the Duccio, I received an email from Tom Hoving, the first communication, and he said in his email, Philippe, the Duccio for you is what the Bury St. Edmund's Cross was for me. That he considered that his greatest acquisition and wrote a whole book about the Bury St. Edmund's Cross. So to me that was very moving to have that applause from somebody I admired greatly and who was, oddly enough, for me, a mentor.
There's a very beautiful moment in the book where Philippe is contemplating the acquisition of the Duccio, and it's a devotional object, and you're holding it, and you describe the pleasure, almost electric, of...
Libidinal, I'd say.
I wasn't going to... See, the Marquis de Sade never leaves you. I wasn't going to go there. But all I could think about was, and that's the last time that object will ever be held by anyone again.
Not even by a restorer. They now wear latex gloves.
But I wanted to talk for a moment before we open this up to all of you about contemporary art. One of the things that you don't discuss in your book at all is anything really even into the 19th century, not to mention the 20th century. And there are those in the world who have thought that maybe you weren't interested in contemporary art. Would that be a fair statement?
Fancy that. No, it's not a fair statement. You used, thank God, the word interested. I am interested in contemporary art because I'm fascinated by fascination for contemporary art, and I want to understand it.
I should warn you, there are a number of contemporary artists here besides Marina. They're all sitting back there.
Being alive and creating works of art doesn't make you a contemporary artist. Contemporary art for me is with a capital C, and I think we all understand what that means in opposition to... I mean, Jasper Johns is not a contemporary artist, but he's alive and still creating. But I think you would argue that he's not a contemporary artist with a capital C. I have to say, one of my passions is medieval art. There isn't a single work of medieval art in the book. We didn't happen to go to the Musée Cluny in Paris or to the cloisters. There are some antiquities. There's no Islamic art, which is a passion of mine. Yours is a professional passion. I have collected it. I love it personally. So the book is not altogether such a reflection. I will say I have a professional interest in contemporary art. I teach full-time at the Institute of Fine Arts, and I teach graduate students, and I obviously have to deal with the continuum of art history. I have often gone to some of your curators, particularly one, Christophe Chérix, to try to get him to explain to me many of the things that are created by contemporary artists, and more than one here, and one that you have shown, who is here today. And so while I may not have the same engagement with many of these works that I have with others, I am interested in understanding them. I am also, being a historian, have to acknowledge and recognize that a number of artists creating today are going to make the cut over time and need to be paid attention to. And so in an intellectual way, perhaps more than in an affective way, I do look at contemporary art.
Actually, no, he does. I wanted him to talk about that. Are there questions out there? Yes. Stand up and speak as loudly as you can, please.
Well, the question was, is it all right? And is it safe for so many people to actually go around museums with their cameras taking pictures? Essentially, that's your question. And I would say you can't go against the trends. I take pictures all the time in museums, but I take them for professional reasons. I turn them into slides for my students. This is not how I look at works of art. Most people actually take pictures in order to show their friends that they've been there. But you know, this is what should be a free world, free will, and if that's the experience you want, so be it. You can't stop people because they're not cameras, they're phones, and everybody has a phone. And now museums actually place on the phone that take pictures. I don't know the name of all these things. They're electronic things that inform apps. No, when something else where you text, you can actually look up a work of art and the phone will tell you about it. So you can't stop that. Occasionally, as you point out, there might be a damage, somebody getting too close. But you know, if you follow Barnett Newman and his definition of sculpture, then a sculpture in the middle of the room is dangerous too. You know, his definition of sculpture is the thing in which you stumble when you back away from a painting. But in point of fact, given the millions of works of art on public view today, the incidence of damage, frankly, from these cameras is not, how should we say, immaterial. What does the damage?
Oh, I hate the notion that those flashes do damage to works of art goes back probably 40 or 50 years to when the first flash cameras came out with high intensity flash. I think one of our conservators, I asked him this very question about the flashes from cell phones and the degree to which they might damage by exposure to light a work of art. He said, well, if you had 30 or 40 million flashes within the span of a couple of days, they might create enough light to do damage. The issue isn't about the flashing of the light. The issue has to do with whether somebody might inadvertently drop their camera back into the camera and not see someone. That, I think, is a legitimate concern, but the actual light levels aren't affecting either drawings or paintings because they're so infinitesimal at this stage. Another question. Yes?
How do you feel about the proposed movement, and I know it's going to happen, of all of the modern work at the Metropolitan being moved to the Whitney?
How do I feel about the proposed movement of all of the modern work going to the Whitney? First, I know not everything about this because I'm not the architect of this particular policy. What I do know about it, however, seems to me to make eminent sense because this is not a permanent move. The Wallace Wing, which is the name of the wing devoted to modern and contemporary art at the Met, is completely inadequate in terms of both space and ability to show art, and especially now with the addition of the Leonard Lauder collection of Cubists that I had a little something to do with for many years. There's no question that building has to be torn down, at least 2 to 3 more floors built below ground, which no one should really object to. They will be invisible, making much more room for displaying within the Met the continuum of art history. It will take several years to build that wing. during which the Whitney will then be used as the swing space for the display of modern contemporary art. If the Met, I gather, from Tom Campbell, my successor, if they're able to create programs and somehow it becomes a destination, people visit both the Met and the Whitney, and they can create imaginative shows where modern and ancient cohabit in intelligent shows. They might keep their lease on the Whitney, but it's a temporary lease. This is not a substitution.
I should say it was a great move on the part of the Met as a colleague. When you think about how the Met can't really expand, right? Its footprint is fixed. So all it can do is renovate its existing spaces and periodically squeeze out some additional gallery space by shuffling offices or whatever around. So the fact that it has a building really almost across the street from it where it can continue to display its important collections while parts of the museum are being renovated, I think is a terrific thing. And I think if it follows exactly the kind of trajectory that Philippe was talking about, it's a win for New Yorkers. Imagine when the Islamic galleries were being renovated and how much great material wasn't on view that could have been on view, or when the Greco-Roman galleries were being renovated. So if you think about it as almost the ideal swing space for a great institution, I think it's a great gift to New Yorkers. Other questions?
I've been interested in, recently in the literature of the impact of technology on human behavior. And there's a interesting school that understands the way in which technology has discouraged conversation. And I'm wondering if, from the point of view of the architects and the directors of these great institutions, whether you have any sense or observation about how, if at all, technology is having an impact on the way we see and the way we experience aesthetics.
I actually think when done well, technology facilitates conversations. I mean, I think one of the great things that has happened through social media, the internet, Instagram, is that you can see something in a museum, share it with friends who might not even be in the museum, and sustain a dialogue over a long period of time about that work of art and the ideas that it generates. And I think even those quick souvenir snapshots that some people take, or many people take in a museum, actually often are high enough resolution that when you go home and you download them on your computer, you see something that's really interesting. And with the Google Art Project that has produced extraordinary high resolution images now, you can zero in and see details that are beyond imagination. I find myself every once in a while when I'm suffering from severe ADD at work, go onto Google Art, go to the Met, go to the Museum of Modern Art, go to any of the museums that are part of it, and go to that one image that has the super high resolution. You can learn so much from that. So I don't think technology is the enemy of careful looking, but I think we have to all be skillful in harnessing it to enable the kind of thoughtful engagement that often is impossible in the pell-mell of hyper-crowded galleries. That's how I look at it.
I don't disagree with that at all. In fact, what Glenn brings out with the Google Art Project is another one of the paradoxes of our world, and one that actually has upset me to a certain degree, which is discovering, for example, the Prado has the Hieronymus Bosch of the Garden of Jardin des Délices, I don't know what it is,
Earthly Delights.
of Delights, on Google Art Project, when it has, I don't know, hundreds of figures, as you know, And when you stand in front of it, behind the stanchion, which is too far away from the picture, and always a knot of people around it because it's so well known, you can barely see it. But sitting comfortably in your armchair with your Havana cigar and looking at Google Art Project, I have found and been disturbed by the fact that I actually found a true high level of aesthetic enjoyment at zooming in on figures that my eye could not normally zoom in. The eye doesn't have a zoom lens. So to a certain degree, we are seeing almost more than the artists did, or we are seeing it the way Philippe II saw it, which is repeatedly and repeatedly. It was in his bedroom. And so he was able to see it many, many times. This is a way to devote a great deal of time, if you happen to own the picture, to looking, is by going back and back and looking at the work of art, which, of course, repeat visitors could do. But the notion that it can be so satisfying for me, who have always proclaimed that the authenticity and the real is the only thing that counted, I found disturbing and possibly an opening onto another way of looking at art in the future.
Bill?
I'd just like to go back to where you began the conversation, which was on museum accessibility. And this is less a question than an appreciation. Because I think both of you have been real leaders in bringing curators and educators together. And I just wanted to say thank you for that. And to follow up on what Ham was saying, I know MoMA has been doing teaching workshops online, and they reach thousands and thousands of teachers internationally with one program online. So I think you both your institutions now are using technology in really astounding and exciting ways. And thank you.
So I want to give Philippe the last word, and I wonder if you would recount an anecdote that I thought was just utterly marvelous in Rendezvous with Art, and that's when you went to visit Sir Harold Acton.
So long as it's not an excuse not to buy the book. I happened to have a travel grant from the Met in 1966, and I was in Florence. I think it was in November, and it had rained for days. I had an appointment with Sir Harold Acton, who's a great English humanist of our time, and whose Villa La Pietra is now owned by NYU. I remember literally having to run from the Arno River to my hotel because the floods of Florence, about you all have read, began at that time, and by the time I reached my hotel, my ankle deep in water. So we all moved in. We had a little pensione, and we all moved up, and this little pensione was in the Villa del Calzaioli, which, if you lean out the window, leads to the, you see the baptistry in the front of the Duomo. And for 2 days, what we saw was nothing but cars and furniture moving at rapid pace along the Reed, 8 feet deep water, and slamming into the Ghiberti doors of paradise. And after 2 days, when the floods began to recede, I moved towards the Campanile and the Duomo, and the great Ghibertis and the doors were lying on the ground face down. Some of the gilt scenes had been detached, and inside the baptistry was the great Donatello, which had water, I guess, up to her chest, and mud. This was the morning at which I had the luncheon scheduled with Sir Harold in La Pietra at 1 p.m. or whatever it was, and I decided, well, I'm going to go anyway. And so, of course, there was no means of transportation, and so I walked up. I think it's about 1.5 kilometers up in the hills over Florence. And I reached La Pietra more or less on time. I rang the door. The footman or Maître d'hôtel answered, took one look at me and said, "You are coming for lunch with Sir Harold? You're covered with mud, sir." Of course, there was no means of communication. They had no idea what had happened in Florence at the time. And so I said in 2 words, there was a disaster, can I please see Sir Harold? Who came to see me. In 2 words, I explained to Sir Harold there'd been a flood. He said, my goodness. He put on his hunting boots. We went into his car as close as we could to Florence. Then we came out, walked out. I took him to the piazza. Sir Harold looked at the Donatello and wept. And that was my one meeting with Sir Harold Acton. So that's one of the many anecdotes that I tell in the book.
A great, great aesthete, museum director, philosopher, art historian. Thank you so much, Philippe.
And a wonderful colleague.